The weight of it all settled on Alex's shoulders, a pressure both physical and emotional. The chilling echo of the room amplified the tremor in their heart. They had been here for what felt like an eternity, each moment a stark reminder of the gamble they had taken, the promise of something better. A chance to rewrite the narrative of their life had led them to this unsettling place. The room, stark and unforgiving, mirrored the fear swirling within them. The air was thick with unspoken anxieties, a collective dread that hung heavy, a visible fog in the dim light. It wasn't the fear of failure exactly, but the profound, soul-shaking terror of what failure would mean, the loss of everything. Every breath felt like a heavy weight, a constant reminder of the stakes. This was more than a game, it was their existence teetering on the edge. This first step, the first game, the first chance to survive, was both terrifying and necessary. The red glow cast long, distorted shadows across the field, turning the ordinary into something menacing. It was as if a fever dream had been given physical form. The silence was a living entity, broken only by the soft rustle of their own breath and the almost imperceptible shuffle of feet beside them. The sheer size of the digital doll, its vacant stare both captivating and terrifying, was designed to intimidate, to establish dominance. Every fiber of Alex's being was on high alert, senses strained to their limits. They looked around at the other figures lined up beside them, seeing reflections of their own fear in their postures, a silent acknowledgement of the shared predicament. This wasn't a competition among rivals, but a unified struggle against the overwhelming odds they faced. Each person was both a fellow traveler and a potential reminder of their own mortality. The weight of it all felt like a physical thing, pressing down on them with each passing moment. There was a moment, just a fleeting second, where doubt threatened to consume Alex. A tiny voice in their head whispered insidious words of failure, of giving up before they'd even begun. But then they remembered why they were there, the things they were fighting for, the life they desperately yearned to reclaim. That small spark of determination ignited, pushing back the fear and replacing it with a steely resolve. Their eyes narrowed, focusing on the seemingly insurmountable challenge that lay ahead. They became aware of their own body, the tension in their shoulders, the pounding in their chest, and used it to center themselves. This wasn't about raw skill or luck, it was about the will to endure. This was about survival, pure and simple, and in that moment, Alex understood that it would take every ounce of strength they had to make it through. The collective tension was palpable, a tangible wave that rolled across the field as the doll turned its back. The players moved forward in a hesitant ballet, each step measured and deliberate. Every sound, the crunch of footsteps on the grass, the rustle of clothes, seemed amplified, a betrayal of their presence. It was a game of inches, a frantic rush to gain distance while avoiding detection. The fear of the unknown hung heavy in the air, the anxiety of the moment stretching out into what felt like forever. The weight of unspoken communication, the shared hope, the collective fear all contributed to the intensity. There was an almost unspoken agreement, a kind of fragile alliance formed in shared hardship. In this moment, they were all moving together, a single unit, each person's success and failure influencing the others. It was a delicate dance, one misstep leading to irreversible consequences. The chilling mechanical whir of the doll's head turning was enough to send shivers down Alex's spine. A chorus of gasps swept through the field, quickly cut short by the sudden silence as everyone froze. The figure that was caught, frozen in mid-stride, a stark reminder of the game's cruelty, was just a few steps away from safety. The image was a vivid reminder of the consequences of even the slightest error. A collective gasp echoed from the others, a mixture of shock and relief that it wasn't them. It was a brutal display of fate, a moment of utter stillness filled with the unspoken terror of what could be. The game was no longer abstract, it was visceral, it was real. This was not a game of skill, but a game of chance, where a single lapse in judgment could bring a catastrophic end. The faded silhouettes of the eliminated participants were an eerie reminder of the brutal reality of the game. Each translucent figure stood motionless, marking the spot where hope had been extinguished. Their silent presence was a chilling testament to the high cost of failure, a visual manifestation of the risks involved. The weight of it all crashed down on Alex, the realization that any of them could become one of those specters at any moment. This was more than just a game, it was a brutal test of survival. The visual reminder served as both a warning and a motivator. the stakes clearly defined in the lost souls standing motionless in the field. There was an unspoken agreement amongst those remaining. They would fight, even if it meant that they wouldn't be going home at the end. Every step was now a prayer, every heartbeat a desperate plea for survival. There was a newfound resolve in Alex's stride, a controlled intensity that belied the panic churning within them. Their focus narrowed to the immediate task, each movement calculated and precise. They had accepted the terror, the risk, and were moving with a determined focus. The field seemed to shrink, the vastness of the challenge replaced by a laser-like concentration on their own path. The weight of the previous failures, the chilling reminder of those lost, served as fuel, pushing them forward with unwavering intent. They moved with a quiet determination, blocking out the chaos around them, focusing only on the space immediately in front. Each breath was a reminder, each step a victory against the overwhelming pressure. They had found a strange kind of calm in the midst of the chaos, a steely resolve that was guiding them. The sight of the finish line was like a beacon in the storm, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive atmosphere. The few figures who had reached the zone stood as tangible proof that survival was possible, that the impossible could be overcome. The air crackled with a kind of nervous anticipation, a sense of collective relief mingled with trepidation for the challenges yet to come. It was a brief pause, a moment to catch their breath and steel themselves for whatever awaited. The seemingly insurmountable task, however terrifying, seemed less impossible now. The finish line offered a moment of respite, the first small victory on a long and perilous journey. The tension, though still there, was laced with the slightest hint of optimism and awareness that they had overcome the odds, at least for this round. Alex reached the finish line, a wave of exhaustion washing over them. They turned back to look at the field, at the faded silhouettes, at the distance they had covered, a sense of profound sadness creeping into the corners of their mind. They had survived, but it came at a price. The victory felt bittersweet, overshadowed by the stark reality of the game. There was a somber awareness, a heavy weight of responsibility. They knew that the next stage would be just as brutal, and they'd need to dig even deeper to keep going. They were more determined now than ever, knowing what was at stake. It wasn't just their life on the line anymore, it was the lives of everyone who had trusted in this path. The brief moment of respite offered no genuine solace. The specter of the games loomed large, a constant reminder of the trials that lay ahead. The fight for survival was far from over, it had only just begun. The road forward was shrouded in uncertainty, the challenges yet unknown but undoubtedly brutal. The ominous gaze of the digital doll in the distance served as a visual reminder of the power, the influence that controlled the game. There was a palpable sense of foreboding, the anticipation for the next chapter, both terrifying and inevitable. The journey was far from complete, the battle far from won, but the resolve of Alex and others remained, a testament to the indomitable spirit that endures even in the face of insurmountable odds. This was just a first step, the first of many trials they would have to face. A chill permeated the air, thick and heavy, clinging to me like a shroud. The world had gone silent, save for the frantic thumping of my own heart. I was just another number, a nameless face in the throng of pixelated figures gathered in this strange, unnerving space. The red walls seemed to pulse with an internal heat, and that towering doll at the end of the room, its expressionless face a mask of indifference, sent shivers down my spine. I glanced at the others around me, a mix of apprehension and false bravado painted across their blocky faces. We were all strangers, bound together by a shared sense of unease, a silent question hanging in the air. Why were we here? What cruel game were we about to be forced to play? The checkered floor felt unstable beneath my feet, each block a potential pitfall in this strange, digital nightmare. I longed for the familiar comforts of the world I knew, but all that existed now was this red chamber, and the looming threat of the unknown. The silence shattered as the doll's head turned, a slow, agonizing movement that seemed to stretch out the seconds into eternities. That unsettling red glow in its eyes locked onto us, and the air crackled with an unspoken command. A collective breath hitched as the realization dawned. This was no random event, no simple game. This was a test, a brutal selection process where the smallest error could be our last. I could feel my muscles tensing, adrenaline coursing through me, preparing me for the inevitable. The thought of moving, of even breathing too loudly, became a source of anxiety. I could sense the others felt it too, that suffocating pressure of expectation, the weight of what was at stake. There was no instruction, no guidance, Only the imposing gaze of that doll and the knowing certainty that something terrible was about to begin. The uncertainty was the most terrifying aspect of all, not knowing what was about to unfold. A single, whispered word echoed in the chamber. Green. It was the release, the starting gun of our terrible race. A wave of movement rippled through the group, everyone lunging forward, trying to gain an advantage. It was a chaotic ballet of pixelated forms, each one fueled by a desperate need to survive. I pushed forward, my focus laser sharp, trying not to focus on the flailing limbs around me. The blurred movement all around made it hard to maintain my balance, but I dared not falter. I had to keep moving. Every step was a gamble. Every fraction of a second a calculation. The initial rush of adrenaline was quickly replaced by a cold, focused determination. I could hear the panting, the shuffling of feet, the silent desperation of the others, all swallowed by the space around us. I tried to avoid their gaze, knowing that a single moment of distraction could be fatal. My only goal was to make it to the next phase, whatever that may be. And then, the word came, red. A harsh, guttural command that froze us all in place. A wave of panic washed over me as I frantically tried to still my movements. Every muscle screamed to continue, to run, to move, but I forced myself to remain as rigid as possible. It was as if time itself had warped, with each millisecond feeling like an eternity. I saw, out of the corner of my eye, someone topple over, their form disappearing into the floor like they had never been there. The sight jolted me with a fresh dose of fear. This was more than just a game of elimination. This was annihilation. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about surviving. The pressure was immense, and the slightest twitch could cost you everything. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The unmoving silence punctuated only by the shallow breaths of those trying to remain as still as stone. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, each beat a reminder of the fragility of this digital life. The doll spoke again, its voice mechanical, emotionless, green. This time, the movement was more cautious, less frantic. I felt a surge of strength within me, a refusal to be another discarded pixel in this dreadful game. I moved with purpose, each step deliberate, each footfall measured. The others mirrored my approach, their movements more precise, less chaotic. It was a shared sense of focus, a silent understanding of what it would take to make it to the next round. The determination in the air was palpable, and I could sense the will to survive growing stronger with each passing moment. I was no longer part of the chaotic mass of pixelated figures. I felt myself an individual, a conscious entity fighting against a system designed to crush. I had to keep going. I would not be erased. I would survive. The game continued, a terrifying cycle of green and red, move and freeze. Each cycle tested not only our physical ability to stay still, but also our mental fortitude. The waiting between each command was just as agonizing as the movement itself. The tension was a tangible entity, pressing down on us, trying to crack our resolve. But we persevered, learning to anticipate the commands, to control our breath, our heartbeats. We were learning, adapting. The initial chaos gave way to a kind of grim harmony, an understanding of the brutal rhythm of this strange game. I saw in the faces of others not just fear, but also a glimmer of determination. We were all fighting not just against the doll, but against the game itself, against the possibility of erasure. There was a bond forming between us all, forged in the crucible of this digital nightmare. The cycle repeated itself, and again, someone fell, their digital form vanishing from view. It was a stark reminder of the high stakes. Each lost figure sent a ripple of fear through the remaining group. But it also served as a stark encouragement to fight harder, to remain ever vigilant. The sense of collective purpose began to intensify as we navigated this treacherous terrain. It was a cruel and merciless game, but it had brought us together in a strange, albeit harrowing, way. We began to develop a silent language, an understanding of subtle cues and hints of movement. We were starting to understand the inner workings of this digital world, the delicate balance of action and stillness. We were becoming survivors. The finish line was now in sight, a simple white line drawn across the floor. It was an oasis in the middle of this red sea of chaos. I focused on the line with a sharp intensity. A burning desire for this to end coursing through my digital veins. Every muscle was tense and strained. I could almost feel the finish line beneath my blocky feet, the promise of a brief reprieve. The remaining figures edged closer, each one battling their inner demons, their exhaustion, their fear. We had come so far, endured so much. Failure now was unthinkable. We had to push through. We had to survive this. There was a silent understanding between us as we neared the goal. Each of us knowing that the battle was almost over, but also that the fight for survival had only just begun. We crossed the line, one by one, collapsing to the ground, our digital forms shaking with exhaustion. The initial relief was immense, a wave of euphoria that quickly faded into an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. We had survived. We had crossed the finish line of this initial challenge. But the game was far from over. The doll still stood there at the end of the chamber, its red eyes burning into us, a constant reminder of the danger still to come. We looked at each other, our expressions a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and apprehension. We were survivors, for now. But there was an unspoken understanding that this was just the beginning. This was not the end of the game, but the beginning of a whole new level. The true test of our strength and resilience still lay ahead of us. The red room vanished, replaced by a dimly lit corridor. Another space, another trial. The air was heavy with anticipation, and a sense of unease pressed on my every move. We had survived the first test, but what new horrors awaited us beyond that door? I looked at the faces around me, each face worn and weary, but with a fire of resilience still burning. We had come this far. We had faced the unknown and survived. We had proven our strength, both individually and together. It was time to move forward, one foot in front of the other. I was ready. We were ready. We had tasted survival, and we were willing to fight for it. With one final breath, I turned toward the door and stepped into the unknown. The silence was a physical thing, pressing down with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. This wasn't the vibrant, bustling Minecraft world I knew. This was a replica, cold and sterile, a stark reminder of the game's grim purpose. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet dread. I could almost taste the metallic tang of anxiety in the air, feel the phantom chill of the unknown wrapping around me. I spun slowly, my gaze sweeping across the vacant redstone expanse. Everything felt manufactured, meticulously planned. The emptiness was more unsettling than any monster I had ever faced in the game before. I know, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the familiar comfort of Minecraft had given way to something far more sinister. I was here, but I wasn't in control anymore. I had a strange urge to turn and run, but another part of me refused to. A wave of newcomers materialized, each avatar a silent testament to the shared predicament. There were no words, only the tense shuffle of digital feet and the nervous twitching of blocky shoulders. A sense of camaraderie, born of shared trepidation, settled over us like a heavy blanket. I scanned the line, recognizing the pixelated faces of several familiar server regulars. We usually engaged in light-hearted banter, working together to build elaborate contraptions, but now, their faces mirrored my own mixture of unease and determination. A collective inhale rippled through the group, and we knew, without needing to be told, that the game was about to begin. The giant redstone doll loomed at the end of the course, its single-eye menacing beacon. It was the silent judge of our fates and the controller of this twisted playground. I wanted to reach out to someone, to connect, but the air was charged with a palpable fear. We were each on our own in this pixelated arena. The doll's eye flickered a vibrant green, and an electric jolt coursed through me. It was a signal, a release from the oppressive stillness. We surged forward, a chaotic yet unified current, every block moving with desperate purpose. The game was on. I pushed ahead, my digital legs pumping, not thinking about the other participants or the challenges that lay ahead. Only the green, a symbol of life. My focus narrowed to the course ahead of me, every movement calculated and precise. The game was not about speed, it was about timing. Each step was measured, each blink an opportunity to advance. The digital wind rushed past me, the air thick with a mixture of hope and the undeniable possibility of failure. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like a real race. I concentrated on my breathing, in sync with the game's rhythm. A little too fast, too early, and the consequences would be devastating. The green evaporated, replaced by an instant, searing red. Time stood still. A collective gasp echoed around the course as the majority of avatars froze. Those still moving, however briefly, were instantly deleted, their bodies fading into nothingness. a silent testament to the game's unforgiving nature. I held my breath, willing my own pixels to stay motionless, like a statue. My muscles ached as I fought the urge to move, but I knew that any movement could be my last. The air hung heavy with the unspoken terror of those who had disappeared. I watched the remaining players try to make themselves as small and still as possible. The tension was palpable. Each remaining movement was an act of defiance against the game. We were prey, frozen in the hunter's gaze, desperate not to be the next to disappear. This game was more than a challenge. It was a fight for pixelated existence. The silence after the red light was more deafening than any explosion. The giant doll stood motionless, a watchful sentinel over our strained faces. Its gaze, pixelated and unyielding, bore down with an intensity that was almost unbearable. I felt like an insect under a magnifying glass, every flaw exposed. The feeling of being observed was intense and unsettling. The silence was broken only by the whirring of the doll's internal mechanisms, a constant reminder of the manufactured cruelty of this game. It was a feeling I knew from survival servers, but now, there was no respawn. The stakes were unnaturally high. It wasn't just about failing a level. It was about being deleted, erased. I felt a shiver run down my digital spine, a primal fear of being wiped from existence. This wasn't just about winning a game. It was about surviving the whims of a programmed adversary. We were all trapped in a nightmare, and the redstone doll was the gatekeeper. The green flashed again, a fleeting burst of hope that ignited a renewed determination within each of us. We moved forward with purpose this time, with a focus that bordered on desperation. Every movement was calculated, every stride carefully measured. No one was taking unnecessary risks. The fear of erasure had sharpened our awareness, each of us acutely aware of the potential consequences of every single pixel's move. There was a strange sense of shared purpose now, of unspoken understanding. We were all in this together, bound by a shared struggle for survival. I could almost feel their thoughts echoing mine, the same driving urge to reach the other side, to make it to the next round. It was as though our shared desperation had formed a bond between us. The fear was still there, but now it was tempered with a newfound courage. We moved as a singular unit, as if a flock of digital birds taking flight. The field was a mosaic of motion and stillness, a stark contrast between the determined and the lost. Some players had pushed too hard, moving even before the light had changed, their digital existence extinguished in a pixelated flash. It was a constant reminder of the game's brutality. The tension hung heavy in the air, thick enough to cut with a diamond pickaxe. Every moment was a testament to the fragility of life, even in this virtual world. The few remaining players moved with deliberate precision, making their way closer to the finish. They showed no emotion, only the cold calculating focus of survival. I tried to predict the pattern of the changing light, an inner game within the game itself. It was a gamble, and every move was a risk. This was no longer just a competition. It was a gauntlet, and we were the ones running it, with the ever-present redstone doll as the arbiter of our fate. I knew the end was in sight, but the fear of stumbling remained ever present. The finish line appeared on the horizon, a symbol of safety. It looked deceptively close. Each breath was slow and deep, each step deliberate and focused. My digital muscles burned, and the desire to break out into a sprint was almost unbearable, but the risk was too great, and I had seen too many fade into nothingness. I needed to be cautious. I studied the patterns of the redstone doll, trying to predict its next shift. This was more than just luck. It was about anticipation, about feeling the flow of the game, and about adapting to its relentless changes. The green light appeared again, and I moved with a newfound energy, knowing that this could be my final chance. The finish line was within reach, a tangible symbol of hope. I felt my own heart pumping in my chest as if it was going to burst, but I pushed on. The thought of actually making it to the end was both exhilarating and terrifying. I crossed the finish line, a wave of relief washing over me. The game was over. I had survived. I looked around at the other players who had made it, and I could see a similar mix of exhaustion and triumph on their faces. The group stood together, a small band of survivors, bonded by the shared ordeal. It was a moment of profound connection, a tacit acknowledgement of the struggle we had endured. The weight of tension that had been pressing down lifted and the air felt lighter. It wasn't the joy of winning a game, it was the profound relief of having survived. We had cheated deletion and lived to fight another digital day. I wanted to reach out, to celebrate, but the knowledge of what we had just experienced hung in the air, a somber reminder of the dangers we had faced. We were alive, for now, and that was enough. The redstone doll powered down, its eye finally dimming, and the virtual world began to disassemble. The sterile, imposing game field faded, as if waking from a terrible nightmare. The Minecraft world began to return to its familiar, pixelated self, the sky a vibrant blue again. The trauma, however, lingered like a digital scar. We knew that although this round was over, the game may not be. The experience had changed us, leaving an indelible mark on our shared consciousness. We were now aware of the depths of the game's cruelty, and that knowledge would stay with us. Even as the world normalized, a seed of unease had been planted. We may return to building and adventuring, but I knew that we would never truly look at our server the same way. We carried the memory of the game, and the faces of the fallen. We had survived, and we would not forget. The chill in the air was almost palpable, a stark contrast to the vibrant world we usually inhabited. We found ourselves in this strange, desolate playground, its familiar pixelated forms warped into something menacing. It felt like we had been pulled into a nightmare, the cheerful blocks replaced by an ominous tension. We stood there, a collection of diverse figures, each silently grappling with the surreal reality. A colossal doll, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through you, held court at the far end of the field. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the distant hum of some unknown machine. Everyone knew, without a word spoken, that this was not a game to be taken lightly. A sense of dread mingled with curiosity, an uneasy cocktail that left a knot in the pit of your stomach. This wasn't the Minecraft we loved. This was something else entirely, something dangerous, something that threatened to change everything we knew. I could feel the weight of the situation settling on my pixelated shoulders, a physical pressure almost. A quick glance around revealed that I wasn't alone in my apprehension, the faces of my companions mirroring my own internal turmoil. Some fidgeted nervously, their blocky fingers adjusting clothes that didn't need adjusting, while others stood like statues, trying to project a strength they probably didn't feel. There was a shared, unspoken understanding, a collective awareness that we were all in this together, regardless of our backgrounds or skins. But beneath that camaraderie, an undercurrent of individual fear simmered. We were players, yes, but we were also something more, entities with our own unique hopes, fears and stories. And in this warped game, those stories felt both fragile and incredibly important. We all wanted to see a way out of this surreal prison. Then, the doll's gaze intensified, the glowing red eyes seeming to burn into each of us. It was the signal, the unspoken command to begin. A wave of nervous energy rippled through the group as we moved forward, tentatively at first, like wary animals approaching a water hole. Each step felt heavy, laden with the weight of the unknown. The usual joy of movement in this digital world was replaced by a staccato of anxiety. The simple act of walking felt like a Herculean task as we attempted to control our fear. The ground ahead looked immense, the distance to the doll seeming to stretch out impossibly far. Every breath was a conscious act as each individual tried to stay calm, to maintain some control in a situation that felt completely beyond our control. This wasn't just a game anymore, it was a test of endurance, both physical and mental. The pace quickened, the hesitant steps transforming into a more urgent run. Adrenaline pulsed through our digital veins as the distance to the doll started to close. Yet, in this surge of motion, the strain began to show. The pixelated figures faltered, their movements becoming less coordinated, more chaotic. Some stumbled, while others froze mid-stride, caught between the desire to move and the paralyzing fear of being caught. The intensity of the game had taken hold, turning simple movement into a chaotic race against an invisible enemy. Every muscle in our blocky bodies screamed with the effort of exertion. We were pushing ourselves to the limits, the line between controlled movement and reckless abandon rapidly blurring. The game had revealed our vulnerabilities, testing our courage, and showing how much we yearned to survive. The doll's eyes were like laser pointers, sharp and unforgiving, and one by one, individuals became trapped in its gaze. I saw one, a pixelated figure with bright blue textures, freeze right in front of me, a perfect imitation of a startled rabbit caught in headlights. The awkward position they were frozen in spoke volumes about their internal struggles. They had been close, so very close to the finish line, their hope now replaced with a stillness that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. This single moment served as a stark reminder of the stakes of this surreal game, how quickly things could shift, how fragile hope could be. There was an overwhelming feeling of helplessness as we witnessed another player removed from the flow, a casualty of the game's rigid rules. The silence that followed their capture was almost deafening, a heavy blanket that smothered the remaining hope. From the doll's perspective, we were no longer individuals but a collection of targets. The field was scattered with frozen figures, their once animated movements now replaced by a rigid stillness. Each frozen player was a silent testament to the game's brutality, each one reminding those still moving to be vigilant, to be more careful. The remaining figures began to move again, a slow, almost painful progression that showed the weight of their situation. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a strange kind of resilience, a refusal to succumb to the overwhelming pressure. We were survivors, but we were also witnesses to the game's ruthlessness, and that knowledge changed us, making us even more determined to move forward, one hesitant step at a time. We tried to keep our gaze away from the frozen, to keep the horror they embodied from becoming too much. The remaining figures pressed on, their movements deliberate and controlled, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. They moved with a mix of caution and resolve, their eyes fixed firmly ahead, refusing to be distracted by the dangers that lay to either side. The earlier panic had morphed into a quiet determination, a stubborn refusal to let fear win. Each step was measured, each movement calculated as we tried to keep our focus sharp. The doll was still a threat, its ever-watchful gaze a constant reminder of the high stakes. Yet, instead of letting that fear paralyze us, we used it to fuel our drive, to push ourselves further. We had seen what lay in store for the caught, and we were determined not to become another still statue in the field. There was a quiet understanding that we had to work together to overcome these obstacles, even though it was a game of individual survival. The finish line came into view, a simple white line that seemed like a beacon of hope in this terrifying digital world. A surge of energy rippled through the figures, their focused strides becoming more purposeful. We knew, with each step, that we were closer to escaping the clutches of the giant doll, closer to the end of this surreal nightmare. The finish line was no longer just a destination. It was a symbol of survival, a testament to our will to keep moving forward despite the odds. Each figure seemed to move with a newfound determination, a refusal to be defeated after coming so far. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a mixture of anticipation and relief. The end was in sight, but there was still a sense of unease, a subtle whisper that the game could still change, that something could go wrong. With a final, desperate surge, we crossed the finish line. A wave of relief washed over us, a physical release after the intense stress. Yet, the exhaustion was palpable, the weight of the game settling heavy on our pixelated forms. We had made it, we had survived, but the experience had changed us. We carried the weight of the game in our very code, the memories of those lost etched into our very being. The doll was still there, its red eyes now dull and lifeless. The field stood silent and empty except for us, the survivors, our victory tinged with a lingering sense of loss. It was over. But the fear and uncertainty, the memories of frozen companions lingered, a haunting echo of the game's brutality. We had escaped, yes, but we carried the scars of this strange trial. The playground was eerily still, the only sound being the distant hum of the game's mechanisms. The gray sky began to lighten, a hint of dawn piercing through the darkness. We stood there, the few that had made it through, and we were different now. We were no longer just pixels in a game. We were survivors, each of us carrying the weight of what we had endured. The world around us looked the same, but it felt different, altered by the events of the past few moments. We knew that we would never forget this day, the day we played the red light, green light game. The experience had tested us, pushed us to our limits, and ultimately revealed the strength and resilience within each of us. The end of the game was just the beginning of the aftermath. We would carry the memory of this experience, this warped and dangerous Minecraft world, forward into the rest of our lives. The silence was heavy, pressing down like the gray sky above. Alex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd signed up for a game, a harmless distraction, she'd thought. Now, she found herself standing in this stark, unsettling arena, surrounded by others who looked just as bewildered. The air crackled with unspoken tension. There were no explanations, no instructions beyond the vague whisper of a game with a playful name that belied the anxious flutter in her stomach. Red light, green light, how could something so simple feel so menacing? A strange energy filled the space, a mixture of fear and nervous anticipation, a silent question hanging between each Minecraft avatar. Would it be possible to play through this, to survive? And what did it truly mean to survive a game like this? The thought brought a shiver down Alex's spine, a premonition of something darker than she had imagined. A figure emerged, a jarring splash of scarlet in the monochromatic world. The doll, a looming, almost mocking presence. Its gaze, though pixelated, seemed to pierce through Alex, assessing, measuring. The rules, or rather, the instruction, echoed through the arena. A digitized voice that somehow carried a weight of finality. Green light. Alex took a step, a tentative one, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a desperate drum against the impending quiet. The doll's mechanical movements were oddly disconcerting, its stillness an unnerving contrast to the frantic scramble of movement around it. She watched others surge forward with a desperate, uncontrolled urgency. The playful nature of the game they had been promised was long gone now, replaced with a desperate struggle to keep moving, to stay alive. Every fiber in her body screamed to escape this place. Green light was a chaotic dance, a surge of avatars desperately trying to reach an unseen goal. Alex moved with caution, keeping her eyes on the doll, aware that any lapse in focus could be fatal. The air was thick with the sound of frantic pixelated footfalls, the occasional thud of a body hitting the ground, and the ominous silence that followed. The feeling of panic began to bubble up, a corrosive fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She saw one avatar fall, a slight movement that went unnoticed by others, and then, the eerie silence. Was the game even fair? Did it ever intend to be? How many had been caught already? The question swirled around her, making it harder to focus on the simple action of moving forward. Alex pushed down the panic, focusing solely on keeping pace, hoping, praying this nightmare would end soon. The word hung heavy in the air. Red light. The sudden silence was deafening. Every movement, every breath, seemed amplified. Alex froze mid-step, her body rigid with tension. The doll's unblinking gaze scanned over the arena, and in that moment, she felt exposed, vulnerable. She held her breath, a desperate attempt to remain completely still, knowing that any twitch could be her undoing. A shiver ran down her spine, and she closed her eyes, trying to block out the sense of absolute dread. It felt like an eternity, each second dragging on longer than the last. The pressure was immense, a tangible force that held her captive in place. She imagined the cold, hard floor beneath her blocky feet, and the thought made her even more afraid to move. The red beams were sudden and unforgiving, a flash, and then, they were gone. Two avatars, who had moved almost imperceptibly, vanished. The sight was brutal, confirming Alex's deepest fear. This wasn't a game, it was something far more sinister. It was a stark demonstration of the reality of this place, a brutal display that instilled a desperate, chilling awareness in every participant. The silence that followed was heavier, laden with the fear of not only death but the swift and brutal way it could happen. Alex's body trembled with adrenaline, a cocktail of fear and determination. She knew that even the smallest twitch could be her undoing, and so she stood, as if rooted to the spot, every muscle screaming for release. The feeling of hopelessness grew, a dark tendril that tried to pull her down. Another avatar vanished, a puff of red smoke marking their passing. The reality of the game had sunk in completely. This was a struggle for survival. Alex felt a surge of something akin to empathy for the lost avatar, and a wave of cold terror for herself. The thought of disappearing, just ceasing to exist, was terrifying. She struggled to hold onto the small spark of hope she had left, desperately trying to find a way out of this nightmare. Around her, other avatars stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. The air hung thick with despair, a heavy blanket that stifled every breath. Each passing moment was a reminder of what was at stake, of how easily life could be taken away. The red smoke seemed to linger in the air, a grim reminder that the stakes were impossibly high. With each green light, Alex moved with less of the crowd, a subtle shift that was unnoticed by many. She began to think less about the game and more about escape, her eyes scanning the arena for a weakness, for a way out. The desperation was becoming a sharp edge. A will to survive that trumped her fear. The mindless, frantic movement of others no longer held her attention. She was operating on a different level now. The faces around her had become a blur, and all she could see was the gray, concrete prison in which they were trapped. Something in her hardened, a realization that she had to take control, to find her own path. Her goal wasn't just to survive the round. It was to somehow break free from this horrible game. During a subsequent red light, she saw it a flicker, a glitch in the wall's texture, a subtle imperfection in the rigid gray structure. It was barely visible, but Alex's gaze was drawn to it like a magnet. A tiny spark of hope ignited within her, a belief that perhaps this prison wasn't as inescapable as it seemed. She observed the pattern, tracing the edges of the anomaly with her eyes. An idea began to form, a risky one, but at this point, what did she have to lose? She wasn't going to continue moving in a single line, waiting to be picked off, waiting for her number to be called. She decided that her destiny was not determined by the game but by her own actions. A new green light and Alex acted. Ignoring the frantic scramble of other avatars, she bolted towards the wall. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a reckless abandon that pushed her forward with a burst of speed. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it was no longer fear she was feeling. It was pure determination. She wasn't running from death. She was running towards something more, something unknown but potentially liberating. The others were a blur in her periphery, their movements now insignificant to her own. Every fiber of her being was focused on the wall, on that tiny, barely visible glitch that promised something beyond the arena. It was the only chance she had left. With a final surge, she reached the spot, her form flickering as she passed through the glitch, the pixelated fabric of her Minecraft self momentarily dissolving, before disappearing entirely. The wall sealed behind her, leaving no trace of her passage. The arena, now slightly quieter, remained the same, a cold and uncaring reminder of the brutal game. The doll, its expression unchanged, stood alone, a silent observer, of an absence that made no difference to the game's mechanics. Alex was gone, but her actions left a trace, a reminder of the human spirit that refused to be broken by an uncaring game. She had chosen her path, a path that may have been her escape, leaving behind the others to face their uncertain fates. She may be gone from the arena, but she was not forgotten. The air hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of dread. No one spoke, not a single block moved. We were all just there, each of us a statue in this desolate landscape. The silence was a physical thing, pressing in on our eardrums, amplifying the frantic beat of our hearts. We had all answered an anonymous call, a promise of something better, and yet, here we stood, paralyzed by a shared, unspoken fear. We didn't know each other, but in that moment we were united by the sheer absurdity of our situation. The towering structure looming in the distance, its stark red facade a cruel joke against the dreary backdrop, felt like the only beacon, a twisted promise of an end to this agonizing limbo. We shifted our weight, barely daring to breathe, each internal question echoing the others. What had we gotten ourselves into? Was it possible to turn back? And more importantly, what came next? A voice, as cold and sharp as shattered glass, cut through the oppressive quiet. It spoke not in words, but in pure, distilled dread. The doll's back, a monolith of silent judgment, loomed over us. It began, in a tone that sent shivers down our spines, a countdown, not a countdown to joy or release, but to some unknown trial. The green field, once a beacon of life, now seemed a deceptive trap. We were positioned at a stark red line, a boundary we couldn't ignore, separating us from the promise of progress, of safety. An overwhelming anxiety surged through each of us. We knew, with a certainty that chilled us to the bone, that we were no longer in control. We were pieces in some elaborate game, each of us expendable. The doll's robotic voice, echoing in the vastness, was the only certainty now, dictating our movements, our very survival. With every passing second, the tension mounted, the anticipation almost unbearable. This was it. The first words shattered the silence. Red. The green field flashed crimson, a signal as clear as it was terrifying. Our bodies reacted before our minds could catch up. A mad dash forward, driven by a primal instinct. The ground blurred beneath our feet, a symphony of desperate scrambling, each movement fueled by pure terror. The air was thick with the frantic panting and the thudding of countless feet. The doll's presence felt palpable, a silent observer judging each twitch, each flicker of movement. There was no strategy, no unity, just a mass of individual struggles against an invisible enemy. Some stumbled, others leapt with desperation, each striving to reach the finish line, desperate to avoid some unknown fate. The vibrant green of the field, now stained a deep, menacing red, was a constant, taunting reminder of the peril we were in. The thrill of the chase was quickly overtaken by a terrible, sickening fear. Green, a new word, as sharp and swift as the last, brought the chaotic scramble to an abrupt halt. The sudden stillness was even more jarring than the initial movement. Figures froze, their bodies mid-stride, caught in a grotesque tableau of suspended action. Some were closer to the finish line, their faces etched with relief. Others were farther back, their eyes wide with a desperate dread. The air hung thick, heavy with the weight of those who had failed. Gray pixels flickered around them, a visual representation of their removal, their erasure from this brutal game. The once vibrant green field seemed to mock us, a symbol of the safety we had barely escaped. We watched, helpless, as those pixelated wisps faded into the landscape, a constant reminder of what awaited anyone who faltered. This wasn't just a game, it was a lesson in absolute, unforgiving control. Each failed attempt was a silent, horrifying reminder of the stakes. The relentless cycle continued. The doll's metallic voice echoed through the arena. Why you're a red, green, red, why you're an agonizing rhythm that dictated our existence. Each shift from stillness to movement was a desperate attempt to close the gap, to reach the finish line and the promise of respite. Every moment was an exercise in controlled panic, calculating movements against the ticking clock of that robotic voice. A few were reckless, desperate, a single figure attempting to crawl inch by inch, defying the rules in a silent protest against the game itself. The tension mounted with every repetition, the fear intensifying with each pixelated disappearance. Our minds became finely tuned to every subtle change, every flicker of color, every subtle inflection of the doll's voice. We were no longer just playing a game, we were reacting to a raw, base instinct, clawing for survival. The line between hope and despair was a fine one, easily blurred, and at any moment either one could consume us entirely. The numbers dwindled. The once chaotic field was now sparsely populated, the faces of the remaining figures etched with a terrifying mix of determination and exhaustion. The green field, once a source of dread, now seemed like a sanctuary, the finish line, a glowing beacon in the distance. Every step felt heavy, each movement a calculated risk. The frantic scramble had transformed into a strange, desperate sort of focus, a collective understanding of what must be done. There was no room for fear, only the raw instinct to keep moving, to endure. A strange sort of camaraderie had formed, not from friendship, but from a shared trauma. The absence of the doll, though temporary, brought a moment of fleeting calm, a small respite in the unending pressure. We knew, however, that this was just a pause, a brief breath before the next wave of terror descended. Only a few remained. The final push was a blur of movement, a desperate surge of adrenaline that propelled us across the finish line. The red boundary vanished beneath our feet, replaced by a soft, glowing green, the reward for surviving the first trial. I stood alone, the last figure to cross, catching my breath, the overwhelming relief mixed with the lingering horror of what I had just endured. The silence was different now, not a silence of dread, but of exhaustion, a deafening ringing in the ears. I looked back at the field, now empty, haunted by the pixelated wisps and the memories of those who had fallen. The doll stood motionless in the background, its back to us, a silent reminder that the game was not over, and that another trial loomed. There was no celebration, no joy, only a profound sense of loss, and an aching awareness of what we had lost to get this far. The respite was fleeting. We were herded into a dark, underground space, our bodies still trembling from the last trial. The cold, stone walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The silence here was different, a tense, watchful silence. We were no longer just figures on a game board, we were a unit, united by the shared experience, and by a growing uncertainty of what awaited us. Each glance exchanged was a silent question, a desperate attempt to glean some knowledge of the challenges ahead. The underground space felt like a cage, a prison where we were kept against our wills. Our eyes were drawn to the far wall, where a single, ominous door loomed, an entry point into the unknown. The anticipation felt heavy, suffocating, and yet, beneath the fear, there was a grim determination. We had survived this far, and we would keep fighting. The door creaked open, revealing a path bathed in an ethereal glow. A small light began to spread in the dark space, offering a glimpse into the new trial. Hesitantly, one by one, we started towards the opening, our steps slow and measured, filled with a cautious optimism. The bright light was both welcoming and threatening, a promise of something more, and a potential danger. This was a new beginning, but also a continuation of the game, one that offered little reprieve. The path ahead was unknown, a new arena for this absurd competition, but the shared trauma of what we had already endured offered a strange kind of strength. We had seen the faces of those who failed, had felt the sting of our own fears. We had come this far and we were not ready to give in. Stepping into the light revealed a vast arena, a surreal landscape of vibrant colors and complex patterns. It was a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive underground space, but still, there was a sense of unease. We were no longer on the desolate plains, or the terrifying red and green field, but something even more unsettling. Each block, each carefully crafted pattern felt like a calculated move, a piece in a larger, more complex puzzle. There was no explanation, no instruction, only the vast, open space and the knowledge that the game had once again begun. We had survived one trial, but knew in our heart that we would have to keep pushing, keep fighting, if we were to make it out. The fear hadn't gone away, but we had found a new resolve, a deeper determination. The only choice was to press forward and see what the next phase would bring. The digital world flickered to life, a familiar tension tightening in my chest. It was the arena, rebuilt block by block, a chilling replica of that place. The game we all thought we had escaped had found us again, this time in the pixelated landscape of Minecraft. I remember the initial shock, the almost comical absurdity of it all, a children's game twisted into something so much darker. There was a strange comfort in the familiar horror, though, a warped sense of copyright déjà vu. Around me, figures stood as still as statues. I felt their presence, their unspoken fear, a silent chorus of apprehension echoing my own. We were all waiting, bound by this strange, virtual purgatory, the looming red light painting a sinister glow across the blocky landscape. Each of us carried the weight of past failures, the phantom pains of elimination, hoping against hope for a different outcome this time around, for a flicker of mercy in the digital realm. I saw a figure, its pixelated face a mask of unease. It reminded me of myself on that first day, the raw vulnerability, the desperate hope disguised as composure. I could almost feel the cold sweat trickling down its digital spine, the frantic pounding of its non-existent heart. It was a stark reminder that beneath the blocky exterior, a human spirit, a fragment of memory and emotion, was fighting to survive. Every block a potential obstacle, every turn a leap of faith. This game, this twisted rendition of innocence, stripped away all pretense. We were exposed, vulnerable, our pixelated forms incapable of concealing the terror within. The digital arena, a playground turned battleground, was a constant reminder of the stakes. The very act of playing was an act of defiance, a stand against the unseen forces manipulating our blocky existence. The green light flashed, a sudden jolt of adrenaline surging through our digital veins. The frozen figures lurched forward, an awkward, pixelated sprint toward an unknown finish line. I saw some struggle, a mix of panic and clumsiness in their movements. Others, their strides more confident, almost seemed to glide across the terrain. The difference was stark, the seasoned players versus those newly immersed in this digital nightmare. The doll, now looming, blocky sentinel with its back turned, watched our progress. I felt that familiar sting of fear again, the awareness that every step could be my last. The movement was chaotic yet strangely synchronized, a strange dance of survival dictated by the whims of the game. I could feel the pressure mounting with each stride, the unspoken competition, the desperation to reach the end. The green light felt like a cruel tease, a fleeting moment of respite before the inevitable. The finish line, a blurry destination in the distance, seemed so far away. The figures moved forward, some with a reckless abandon, others with calculated precision. I saw a few start to lag behind, their digital bodies giving way to exhaustion or despair. The red glow was starting to flicker, a visual warning of impending doom. The pace quickened, the tension rising exponentially. Each passing second felt like an eternity, the digital landscape a blur of colors and motion. The pursuit of survival, the drive to cross the line, was a potent cocktail of hope and terror. It was that desperate race against the clock, a constant reminder of our fragile existence, that truly defined the game. We were mere pixels, caught in a digital whirlwind, fighting to simply exist. The red light slammed back, a crushing wave of stillness that froze us all mid-stride. I saw the figure in front of me, a digital statue suspended between movement and surrender. The pixelated face was a perfect reflection of the horror, the realization of failure, the weight of the game. There was a terrible stillness, an eerie silence that filled the digital space. The sudden transition, from frantic activity to absolute immobility, was jarring. It was as if the world had been paused, leaving us stranded in the moment, our hopes and fears frozen in time. The feeling was akin to that awful moment of realization in a dream, when you understand that you are not where you should be. I felt the same despair, the same sense of futility as the countless before me, the ones that didn't make it. The silence was then broken by the soft whisper of disintegrating pixels as some figures disappeared into thin air, their digital lives snuffed out without ceremony. The arena was emptier now, the vacant spaces a grim reminder of the stakes. Those remaining stood motionless, a somber tableau of silent mourning and lingering fear. It was a harsh lesson about the fragility of existence, even in this pixelated world. Each elimination was a blow, a stark reminder of our shared vulnerability. The digital dust, the ephemeral nature of our beings, underscored the precariousness of our situation. The doll, still a silent observer, watched over the remaining figures, its cold gaze bearing witness to our struggle. The game continued, relentless and unyielding, stripping away both the physical and the emotional until all that remained was an almost primal desire to survive. But within the remaining figures, there was a shift, a stirring of defiance. As the green light flared once more, a different energy surged through the digital arena. I watched another figure, its pixelated features now etched with determination, its eyes narrowed with resolve. There was a newfound awareness, a burning desire to seize control, to outmaneuver the game. The weight of loss had shifted, transforming into motivation. There was a sense of urgency, a resolve to not simply be a pawn in this twisted game. Each movement now carried a purpose, a calculated step towards survival. The fear still lingered, but it was now intertwined with hope, a stubborn refusal to succumb. The realization that it was indeed possible, no matter how hard, to make the next step. The game may be rigged, but we were not without our own agency, and now, we would fight. This round was different. The figures displayed a newfound awareness of their surroundings, weaving through the landscape with purpose and strategy. There was a tangible shift in the dynamic, a collective attempt to defy the game's cruel intentions. Some figures dodged around obstacles. Others picked up speed, strategizing their movements and watching each other's actions carefully. It was a display of both individual skill and collective effort, a silent collaboration against the odds. The red light flickered dangerously, but it seemed to fuel our determination further. We were no longer mindless puppets, but active participants trying to outsmart our captors. The digital arena now felt like a training ground, an obstacle course where we refined our skills, honing our focus. We had finally turned our fear into a tool, our desperation into fuel, and the result was nothing short of amazing. The finish line, once a distant and daunting goal, became a beacon of hope, drawing us in with an almost irresistible pull. A few of the remaining figures crossed the line, their digital bodies almost glowing with relief and exhaustion. As each one succeeded, the arena behind them began to shift and crumble, dissolving into a peaceful, pixelated landscape. The tense environment, the constant fear, slowly dissipated, replaced by a sense of calmness. It was a moment of collective triumph, a shared victory over the twisted confines of the game. The feeling was almost surreal. The sudden transition from chaos to serenity felt like a dream. This virtual space was finally beginning to reflect the freedom we had collectively fought for. It was a stark contrast to the terror that had preceded it, a testament to the resilience of human spirit, even in pixelated form. The game was over, for now. I watched the single figure standing alone in the tranquil landscape, the weight of past events still evident in its digital stance, a profound blend of victory and solemnity. The digital arena was gone, replaced by a gentle, serene landscape. I realized it wasn't just about escaping the game. It was about what we had learned, about the courage and resilience we had discovered within ourselves. The digital world had been our teacher, our proving ground, a place where we had faced our deepest fears and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger. The echoes of those that fell still lingered, but so did the echoes of victory and our newfound ability to adapt and overcome. Even in the cold, unfeeling structure of a computer game, human spirit managed to shine. The weight of the unknown pressed down, a heavy blanket of dread smothering any semblance of hope. A single, lingering question echoed in my mind. How did I even end up here? 1 minute, I was meticulously building my modest little cottage. The next, I was swept away, finding myself amidst a collection of other lost souls. An invisible force had seemingly corralled us, forcing us into this bizarre game of survival. The starting line felt like a precipice, a point of no return, the cheerful green grass mocking the dread that clawed at my insides. The towering doll, its vacant stare piercing the dim light, sent shivers down my pixelated spine. A strange mix of fear and desperate curiosity wired within me. Did anyone else feel this unsettling mix of fear and a strange, morbid curiosity? We were all alone, bound together by this terrifying, shared experience. This was a game, but it felt more like a trial, an unnerving test of willpower, or perhaps a twisted form of entertainment for some unseen observer. The sudden green flash, an almost violent burst of color, shattered the heavy silence. A surge of movement, almost primal in its intensity, washed over the arena. The starting line dissolved into a chaotic surge of fleeing figures, each one propelled by an urgent desire to survive. The sound of pixelated footsteps echoed all around me as the ground became a blur, a chaotic dance of desperation and hope. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. Every single step felt heavy, charged with a potent mixture of fear and an unnerving surge of adrenaline. The doll's back, a momentary reprieve from its terrifying gaze, offered a sliver of false comfort. Still, the knowledge of its impending turn sent a constant tremor through my being. This rush, this desperate sprint felt like an addiction, a strange and terrifying high. The air was thick with tension, each movement a gamble, every second a potential turning point. We were not mere participants, we were puppets, pulled along by the strings of survival. A sudden, jarring shift, the world around us snapping to a halt. A wave of red washed over the landscape, a stark and unsettling hue that seemed to penetrate even my pixelated form. Every single individual, caught in mid-stride, frozen in time, turned into still-life pieces in a macabre sculpture garden. The doll, its face now illuminated with a fiery red glow, became the center of a horrifying stage. Its eyes, vacant a moment ago, now glowed with an unsettling intensity, scrutinizing every single individual, judging their fate. A cold wave of fear rippled through the group as we understood the true price of failing. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the frantic thumping of my own pixelated heart. Every single muscle was tensed, a battle against the urge to flinch, to move, to make the smallest of mistakes. The game was no longer a distant concept, it was a chillingly real and present threat. The weight of the doll's judgment hung heavily in the air, a constant reminder of the stakes. We were not playing a game, we were surviving in a ruthless reality. A sudden tremor, then a shattering sound that echoed through the arena, an unsettling sound that marked the end for one of us. A figure, caught in a vulnerable pose, disintegrated into a shower of pixels, their essence fading into nothingness. A visible wave of fear spread through the group. This was not just a game of chance, it was a game of survival. Each lost figure served as a stark reminder of the consequences. The doll, seemingly indifferent to the sudden loss, continued its vigil, its red eyes burning into our souls. This wasn't simply a video game anymore. The pixelated remains served as a visual representation of loss, a sharp jab of fear, and a brutal awakening to the stark reality of our situation. A heavy, oppressive wave of despair settled in the arena, a stark contrast to the initial thrill of the sprint. The air thinned, replaced by an uncomfortable mixture of anxiety and morbid curiosity. The game, previously just a terrifying concept, had now transformed into a very real and very dangerous test. The common green light returned, an olive branch after the storm. This time, though, the landscape was different. Gone was the reckless abandon, replaced by calculated movements, a somber dance of cautious navigation. Every single step was taken with measured precision, the earlier fear replaced with a wary sense of strategy. Some crawled, their bodies lowered to the ground, while others walked with deliberate steps, their heads constantly turning to the ominous figure in the distance. The fear of death, having now become a reality, had forced us into a state of hyper-awareness, our senses finely tuned to every change in the environment. This wasn't a simple sprint, it was a meticulous exercise in survival. The doll, still an ever-present threat, now served as a reminder to stay focused, to not falter. The urgency remained, but it had taken on a different form, a slower, more calculated approach. A strange mix of fear and determination fueled our steps, pushing us forward inch by painful inch. The weight of the situation bore down on me, the fear replaced with a singular focus. My vision narrowed to the immediate task at hand, the distance shrinking into a series of deliberate steps. Each breath was measured, a conscious effort to stay calm, to stay in control. The doll loomed in my peripheral view, a looming shadow constantly reminding me of the consequences of failure. My eyes darted back and forth between the path ahead and the source of my fear, desperately trying to anticipate each shift, each turn of the game. This was not simply a physical challenge, it was a mental battle, a test of focus and self-control. The blurred background faded away as I became fully immersed in the present, my world shrinking to the immediate steps in front of me. Every nerve ending was on high alert, each muscle tensed, a constant fight against the urge to succumb to the panic. I was a hunter and a prey at the same time, navigating a battlefield of my own making, one pixelated step at a time. The finish line, previously an abstract concept, was now tantalizingly close. A surge of hope, a fragile bloom in the desolate landscape, pushed through the lingering fear. The distance felt minuscule, a few steps away from freedom, a few steps away from survival. Those closer to the goal moved with renewed purpose, propelled by a potent mixture of desperation and newfound optimism. Others, still trailing behind, quickened their pace, their eyes fixed on the line ahead, their own determination reignited by the visible goal, the doll. Its back turned for a brief moment, offered a flicker of comfort, but the tension remained, the anticipation almost unbearable. This wasn't a simple race anymore, it was the final stage of our ordeal, the culmination of all the fear and struggle. The air crackled with nervous energy as we moved towards the finish line, each step laden with the weight of hope and the potential for despair. The finish line represented not just the end of the game but the chance for a new beginning, the opportunity to escape this pixelated nightmare. A wave of relief washed over me as my pixelated form finally stepped over the finish line. The bright light that enveloped me felt like a baptism, a cleansing of the fear and anxiety that had plagued me moments before. The ground beneath my feet felt solid, the weight of the game finally lifting from my shoulders. Others, close behind, rushed to join me, their bodies blurred from the sudden movement, their relief palpable. The doll, now distant and shrouded in shadow, was no longer the center of my focus. We had made it, we had survived, and a strange sense of unity filled me. This wasn't a victory over the other figures, this was a triumph over the game, a testament to the will to live. This marked a transition point from survival to escape, the final hurdle cleared. We were all changed, transformed by this shared ordeal. We had tasted despair, we had faced the unknown, and we had emerged, somehow, alive. The bright light felt like a promise, a hope for something more, something beyond this digital prison. The arena, once a symbol of fear and desperation, was now bathed in a soft, tranquil glow. The harsh lights were replaced by a calming luminescence, the stark edges softened, and the weight lifted. The finish line, now less prominent, served as a reminder of the journey, a symbol of the ordeal we had just overcome. The surviving individuals, a motley group of pixelated souls, stood around in stunned silence, the adrenaline receding, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Some looked bewildered, their faces etched with the marks of fear, while others were just trying to process what had happened. This wasn't just the end of a game. It was a shared experience, a bond forged in the crucible of survival. An unspoken camaraderie filled the air, a silent understanding that we had all walked through fire and come out the other side. Changed forever, the landscape had changed, but so had we. This bizarre, pixelated world had forced us to face our fears and, in doing so, We had discovered a strength we never knew we possessed. The arena, now empty and silent, held only the faintest echo of the game that had just unfolded. The faint glow in the center offered a stark contrast to the darkness that now encroached from the edges. The doll was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving behind only an unsettling silence. The camera slowly panned upwards, revealing the vastness of the sky above, a seemingly endless expanse of pixels. The experience lingered, a haunting memory, a scar on the digital landscape of my consciousness. We were free, yet the question of what lay beyond remained unanswered. There was a strange sense of peace in the silence, a quiet contemplation of the ordeal that had ended. We had been thrown into a digital world and forced to confront our fears, our vulnerabilities, and our strengths. The experience would forever change me, a reminder of the human will to survive, even within the confines of a pixelated nightmare. The game was over, but a new chapter had begun, a journey into the unknown, the beginning of our own individual stories. It began with an invitation, a whispered promise of something more, something beyond the ordinary humdrum of our pixelated lives. A strange symbol appeared on my screen, a cryptic glyph that beckoned me to join a game, a competition unlike any I had ever known. There was a hint of desperation, a deep-seated longing for escape, and that's why I clicked the join button. The world around me dissolved into blocks, and I found myself standing in a vast, desolate field. I felt a chill despite the digital sun, an unease that settled deep into my bones. The field stretched endlessly before me, a canvas of pixelated grass beneath a pale, almost menacing sky. I was alone, a tiny figure on the edge of something far bigger, and far more intimidating than myself. There was no turning back now, the game had begun. I felt a surge of excitement mixed with a tremor of fear, wondering what challenges lay ahead. The field opened into a surreal playground, a place that was both inviting and terrifying. Towering structures in vibrant blocks stood like silent sentinels, and in the center, a colossal doll looked down with vacant, pixelated eyes. It was undeniably unnerving. The energy of the place was thick with tension and uncertainty. I could see other figures, also arriving, their movements mirroring my own confusion and apprehension. There was no chatter, just a silent understanding that something significant, perhaps dangerous, was about to happen. The playful architecture felt like a deceptive disguise, masking something far more sinister beneath its vibrant surface. It was the kind of place that could have been born from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. There was a strange magnetic pull to the center, to the doll. As if gravity itself was urging us to gather. This was no ordinary game, that much was clear. Then came the voice, a distorted, synthesized sound that echoed through the playground. The rules were simple. Red light, green light. A childhood game, twisted and repurposed for this bizarre arena. A chilling understanding swept through the group as we realized what was at stake. When the doll sang, we could move. When its head turned, we were to freeze. A simple premise with terrifying consequences. The first call of green light sent a wave of motion. Figures dashed forward, a desperate scramble for the invisible finish line. There was no coordination, no strategy, only a raw, animalistic need to survive. Then, just as quickly, the dreaded red light echoed, freezing us in place like statues. It was a strange, silent tableau of awkward postures and held breaths. The air thrummed with anticipation, each moment a tightrope walk between safety and elimination. I was caught mid-stride, my foot awkwardly suspended in the air. A chilling red light flooded the arena as the doll's face turned towards us, its pixelated gaze sweeping through our forms. I held my breath, every muscle tensed, trying to become one with the environment, one with the blocks. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the faint hum of the game's machinery. Time seemed to distort, stretching into eternity. Each passing moment was an agonizing test of patience and self-control. I glanced around, my eyes meeting the desperate expressions of the other figures. I saw a flicker of fear, of determination, in their pixels. I know I wasn't the only one teetering on the edge. It felt like the most vulnerable I'd ever been, all my digital flaws exposed. The slightest movement could be my undoing, and the weight of that knowledge was a heavy burden. A single pop, a burst of pixels, and a figure vanished. The digital world had consumed them. An outline remained where they had been, a stark reminder of the stakes involved. A collective gasp swept through the playground, a silent acknowledgement of the harsh reality that we now faced. Gone. Erased. I tried not to let fear consume me, to focus instead on my movement, on the next green light, on the next step. The game had shifted. It was no longer just a test of reflexes. It was a test of nerve, of psychological endurance. I saw the panic rising in others, their steps growing more hurried, more desperate. It was a tragic ballet of hope and despair, and it made the tension even more suffocating. This wasn't a game about winning, it was a game about not losing, about clinging to the last vestige of existence. The next call of green light propelled us forward again. I moved with deliberate care, my gaze fixed on the doll. Each step was calculated, every movement measured. I had to remain calm, to not let the fear dictate my actions. I noticed how many had already sped ahead, risking everything for a chance of reaching the finish line faster. It was a calculated gamble, but one that could lead to a swift demise. I decided to maintain a steady pace. I observed other figures, their faces etched with desperation. Some stumbled. Some looked as if they were about to crack under pressure. I tried to understand the motivations of those around me. Who were they? What had brought them here? It was a strange sense of unity mixed with an intense competition. A figure next to me lost their composure. They glanced back, panicked eyes widened, and then hesitated. It was a small, almost imperceptible pause, but enough. The red light descended and they became a cloud of fading pixels. I looked away quickly, trying not to see, trying to avoid recognizing myself in their demise. The playground felt like a pit, each step further into the game, a step closer to oblivion. I had to focus, to detach, to become a machine, moving with precision and purpose. The stakes were too high to allow any emotion. It was a battle against my own self-doubt, my own fear, as much as it was a battle against the game. It felt impossible to separate the two now. Each movement had to be perfect. The finish line was in sight, a shimmering pixelated barrier that promised safety, yet the air was heavy with the threat of another red light. Several of us were within striking distance, frozen in place, so close to the end, yet still so far away. A single wrong twitch and it would all be over. It was a painful reminder that even the slightest hesitation can be catastrophic. I could feel my muscles cramping, my mind screaming, that I dared not move. The tension was palpable, a physical force that pressed down on me. I could almost hear the collective heartbeat of those around me, a rapid, and even rhythm. We were all teetering, suspended between survival and the void. The game had become a slow and agonizing dance with fate. And then, the moment I had been holding my breath for, the green light. I crossed the threshold, the shimmering line dissolving as I passed through. The game was over, or so it seemed. The finish line felt anticlimactic, almost underwhelming. I looked back, watching the remaining figures struggle to get through and felt a surge of relief wash through me. I had survived. I had made it to the next stage. The doll's gaze was still, its pixelated eyes now dark and unreadable. The playground was silent, devoid of the tension that had gripped it just moments ago. But there was also a gnawing sense of unease. I knew the game was far from over. The next challenge awaited. I knew the path ahead was uncertain, but I had learned something. Resilience could be found, even in the most pixelated of nightmares. The playground stood silent, a testament to the battle I had just endured. The game had changed me. It had stripped away any illusion of safety or security. I stood alone, amidst the remnants of the challenge, aware that this was just the beginning. The sky grew darker, casting long shadows across the pixelated landscape. I felt a sense of both exhaustion and adrenaline, a strange combination that I knew I would need in the days to come. The lessons learned, etched into my digital soul. Survival wasn't just about skill, it was also about determination, focus, and knowing yourself in the midst of chaos. I was ready for whatever came next. This game was only just beginning. I had survived, and I would continue to survive. It was not just a game anymore. It had become a new reality, a strange, twisted digital existence. A shiver ran down Alex's pixelated spine, a chill deeper than the cold stone surrounding her. The invitation had been anonymous, slipped into her inventory like a forgotten item. Now, standing at the mouth of this shadowy tunnel, a sense of foreboding clung to her like cobwebs. Why her? What cruel game was this? She had been living a simple life, crafting structures, tending to her virtual garden. Just a few days ago, she was admiring a newly blossomed poppy, completely oblivious to the lurking darkness that had now swallowed her whole. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of unseen water, each drop echoing the uncertainty swirling within her. The air felt heavy, thick with the unspoken dread of what awaited. She took a slow, hesitant step forward. A single torch cast elongated shadows, dancing like phantoms on the rough-hewn walls. The feeling of dread is palpable, it's heavy in her stomach. A gasp escaped Alex's digital lips as she entered the arena. The sight before her was both surreal and terrifying. Dozens of figures, each pixelated and distinct, stood frozen in place like statues, all facing a towering mechanical doll, its empty eyes boring into her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faintest hum emanating from the doll itself. Fear mixed with a strange sense of camaraderie as Alex scanned the other participants. These were her people now, bound by the same mysterious circumstances, each harboring the same quiet panic. She realized that all their hopes, their lives in this blocky world, now hung on this single, inexplicable game. The vibrant colors of their crafted clothing were stark against the dull backdrop of this arena, an irony not lost on her. A deep breath does little to calm the rising tide of panic threatening to overwhelm her. She needs to stay alert, to observe. The air crackled with an unseen energy as the doll's blank gaze transformed, its eyes suddenly blazing with a menacing red light. A robotic voice, cold and devoid of emotion, echoed through the arena, "Red light." Instantly, a palpable tension filled the space. Every pixel on every figure stiffened. Alex's breath hitched in her digital chest. This was it. The game had begun. The red glow seemed to intensify as it pulsed, a beacon of danger. The silence became deafening, a pressure building within. Every fiber of her being screamed to move, to run, but a primal instinct for survival held her still. The sudden shift from stillness to this terrifying display sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her system. She must adapt quickly, for survival's sake. Every muscle twitched with suppressed energy, waiting for the next command, like a coiled spring ready to be released. This single moment felt like a lifetime, stretched out, suspended in time. The robotic voice echoed once more, this time with a single, ominous word, "Green light." A wave of frantic movement broke the silence as the participants surged forward. Alex, fueled by a combination of fear and adrenaline, joined the swarm of scrambling figures. She was acutely aware of each step, each movement, the rhythmic thump of her own pixelated feet against the grassy floor. She saw a few figures move with panicked haste, their movements jerky and chaotic, while others moved with a cautious grace, conserving precious energy. It was a delicate dance between speed and stillness, one wrong step leading to unknown consequences. Her focus was intense, every sound amplified, every movement of the doll burned into her memory. The fear of elimination, of whatever punishment lay in store for failure, propelled her onward. The tension hung heavy in the air, an invisible barrier keeping them all on edge. A chilling silence descended as the doll's gaze turned red once more. The robotic voice intoned, "Red light," and time seemed to stop. Alex froze mid-stride, muscles screaming in protest, her heart pounding in her ears. She watched in horror as a red beam shot out from the doll, striking a figure who had failed to freeze in time. The figure, once vibrant and alive, vanished in a burst of red pixels, leaving behind an empty space. The chilling display was a stark reminder of the deadly stakes. A wave of nausea washed over her. The realization that this wasn't a game, not a simple challenge, crashed down with full force. It was a matter of survival, and she was trapped within its cruel grip. A knot of dread tightened in her chest, a primal fear she had never known before. She had to keep moving, she had to keep surviving. The cycle repeated itself, red light followed by green light, each transition accompanied by a surge of adrenaline and a wave of paralyzing fear. Each time, fewer figures remained, their digital existences snuffed out by the doll's merciless gaze. The grassy field, once vibrant, was now scarred with the marks of those eliminated. Alex moved with newfound caution, her eyes darting between the doll and her fellow participants, searching for any sign of weakness or opportunity. The initial chaos had subsided, replaced by a silent, deadly determination. This wasn't just about moving forward, it was about understanding the doll, anticipating its movements, and outsmarting its ruthless logic. The shared terror was now a shared resolve, a silent pact among the remaining participants. They were more than just figures in a game. They were all desperate for a chance to escape, Alex noticed that some of the figures were focusing on speed, darting forward with bursts of energy. Others focused on precision, moving with deliberate, measured steps. She tried to find a balance. She realized that the doll's detection was more than just about stopping. It was about the slightest movement. The fear of a stray pixel out of line forced her to slow down and focus on the minutiae, the slightest twitch of a limb, the almost imperceptible wobble in her pixelated form. Every footstep was a calculated risk, a gamble against the doll's merciless gaze. The weight of survival pressed down, each step a testament to the will to live. She has to control every aspect of her existence in this world. The texture of the grass beneath her feet felt rough and unforgiving, a reminder of the raw reality. Each stride was a battle in itself. With the end in sight, a desperate urgency flooded the field. The remaining figures, thin and exhausted, surged forward, a final push for survival. Alex felt the sting of exhaustion in her pixelated limbs. The finish line, a bright white line etched into the grass, beckoned like a beacon of hope. The doll's eyes were still glowing menacingly, its robotic gaze unwavering. It was a race not just against the doll, but against one's own fear and fatigue. Every pixel was strained to its limit, every movement fueled by the sheer will to survive. She could almost feel the texture of the finish line, the freedom that awaited on the other side. The proximity of the end made her take a deep breath and focus. Every movement had to count. Each step closer was a step towards freedom. The final stretch was within sight. Alex threw herself forward, her pixelated feet pounding the virtual ground. The finish line, finally within reach, passed beneath her. A wave of relief washed over her, so powerful that it almost brought her to her knees. She was safe, for now, at least. She was among the few survivors who had made it. She took a deep breath, the fear that had been gnawing at her now receding. It was replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a strange feeling of emptiness. She looked back and watched as the other survivors reached the line, a group of figures who had shared a harrowing experience. There was no joy in the victory, only a heavy silence that spoke of the lives lost. The game was over, but she felt that this experience was a defining moment. The finish line felt less like a victory and more like a pause before the next, unknown chapter. The arena, now silent and empty, stood as a chilling testament to the game's brutality. The setting sun cast long, somber shadows over the field, a grim reminder of what had occurred. Alex stood alongside the other survivors, their faces etched with a mix of relief and a deep-seated grief. The shared experience, the brush with death, had created an unbreakable bond between them. She looked around at this blocky world with new eyes, forever changed by the events that had just transpired. This world that she thought was so simple and familiar has now become a symbol of the fragility of their existence. She knows that life in this virtual world will never be the same. The sense of hope flickered softly, a fragile flame against the overwhelming darkness, a testament to the resilience of the pixelated spirit. The game had ended, but